Louise Hay, the poor and abused girl who inspired the world. A mistreated and sexually abused girl lived most of her life believing she was useless. Yet, she eventually became the mother of personal growth and a wealthy woman who helped transform the lives of millions of people around the world through the power of the mind. This is the story of Louise Hay, American healer and writer. You won't want to miss this video to learn how she made it. In 1926, Helen Vera Lunny was born into a dysfunctional family in California, United States where, at the young age of 1, her parents divorced, leaving her and her mother, Veronica Chawla, in misery and need. Veronica Chawla began working as a maid to make ends meet, but it broke her heart seeing her daughter crying when she left her in someone else's care. After a few weeks of Helen crying for her, Veronica decided to quit her job and seek alternatives to get ahead in life. Because of this, Veronica opted to marry a man who could give her the life she and her daughter needed. However, this need and desperation ultimately led her to choose an unpleasant man. Helen's new stepfather, Ernest Carl Wanson Reed, was an ill-tempered, abusive European with horrible behavior. Despite his poor character, her mother did not see an alternative opportunity for raising her daughter, so she decided to continue living with this terrible man. Soon after, Veronica became pregnant with her second daughter, making her even more dependent on him. By 1930, now 4 years old, her and her mother's depression was evident due to her stepfather's constant aggression. To make matters worse, the following year, when she was only 5 years old, of their neighbors, an alcoholic, Helen. This event marked a turning point in her life, as she lost her innocence and was devastated in every aspect. To make matters worse, the people around her constantly stressed to Helen that this misfortune was her fault. These frequent words made the 5-year-old girl immensely afraid of the consequences. The manipulative adults in her life had successfully deceived her. Young Helen was terrified of sending a supposedly innocent man to prison. This serious situation did not lead her stepfather pity her or her mother. Instead, he continued to mistreat them physically and psychologically whenever he could, which was very often. In 1941, her stepfather stopped beating Helen, but not because of a sudden miracle, but because he had other disgusting plans. He began to sexually abuse Helen, only 10 years old. This little girl lived a nightmare every day from the beginning of her life, thus generating an ingrained belief that she was worthless and useless. Those beliefs were reflected in the world outside her home as well, since no one took her into account, looking over her or failing to not notice her at all. In 1946, at the age of 15, Helen got tired of so much humiliation, depravity, and mistreatment. She ran away from her so-called home and school. Soon after, she was able to get a job as a waitress to support herself. Due to her low self-esteem caused by childhood physical and sexual abuse, Helen had a particular response when she noticed that a man treated her marginally well or flirted with her. Believing that they were worth it, Helen felt that she should give her body to him almost immediately in exchange for such affection. Because of these decisions, which were reasonable responses given the lack of love in her life, she became pregnant at the age of 15, leading her into despair, since she could not take care of a baby when she could barely take care of herself. This situation led her to feel shame and guilt, making the pregnancy an ordeal. However, she began to look for people to help her. Fortunately, she found a couple eager to have a baby. This couple and Helen made an agreement that Helen would give them the baby soon after birth, and they, in turn, would take care of her and help her with whatever she needed. And so they did. After 4 months of living in the couple's home, Helen, now 16 years old, gave birth to a baby girl. 5 days after giving birth, she handed her over to her new family. That was the last day she would ever see her. After going through the whole process, Helen went straight to her mother's house, where she talked to her mother to convince her that she had to run away from there too. Her mother agreed, as she was exhausted from so much suffering. They both left, leaving Helen's little sister behind with that despicable man. That child was his spoiled brat, and they believed he would not hurt her. Helen got her mother a job as a maid in a small California hotel and rented her an apartment to make her comfortable. After doing all that, ensuring her mother's safety, Helen left peacefully with a friend for Chicago to try to forget what she had experienced. At the time, she had planned to go away for a month, but that's not exactly what happened, as she didn't return for the next 30 years. Since it was the only kind of work she could get, Helen started working in Chicago cleaning houses for a living. These jobs gave her a very low salary that was no use to her. To make matters worse, despite moving to and living in another city, Helen was still mistreated and abused by men who approached her as they were all like her stepfather. Because Helen was so insecure and lacked so much self-esteem, the abusive men sensed it and wooed her with lies so they could use her as they pleased. Louise Hay once said, "If my mental model had not been like that, they would have not been attracted to me." In 1950, after seeing no progress in her life in Chicago, she decided to move to another city, New York, where she was able to get a job as a high-fashion model, and she decided to change her name to Louise. Now, Louise was incredibly successful as a model, but despite working for the best fashion designers at the time, she still didn't feel like she was enough. On the contrary, her insecurities intensified, and she found new ones that made her feel worse. However, she continued with her successful career, which helped her to have a better life and better resources. At this stage in her life, Louise met an Englishman who worked for enterprises. He was a very educated and gentlemanly man named Andrew Hay. Sometime after meeting him, she married him in 1954. From this moment on, Louise would take the name Louise Hay. Louise enjoyed her marriage very much because her husband could give her unique experiences such as traveling all over the world, meeting important people, even royalty, and she could live the experience of having dinner at the White House. The life of, now Louise Hay, took a turn for the better because she had a great career and a wonderful husband. However, she still had very low self-esteem. The years went by, making 14 years of marriage. At this time, when Louise was beginning to feel better about herself and was beginning to feel that her life had taken a steady course, things changed again. In 1968, her husband told her that he had been unfaithful to her with another woman and that he wanted to marry her. These words were a hard blow to Louise Hay. She was devastated. Since there was nothing else to do, she began the divorce proceedings. After the divorce, Louise Hay felt her life change, although at the time she did not know if it would be for the better or for the worse. One day, Louise, feeling a great uncertainty that was choking her, went to a numerologist, that is, a person who seeks to establish a relationship between numbers and life events, who told her that her life would change due to a small event in the fall of that year. Coincidentally, that fall, Louise Hay had a meeting at New York's first religious science church. Hay was in awe of the place, and an inner voice told her to stay and listen. Listening to what this Protestant sect was preaching, she was amazed and decided to join this fascinating new world. Louise began attending Sunday services and listening to weekly classes. These classes made Hay eager to learn more, so she began to read every book that talked about healing and metaphysics, such as those by Florence Scovel Shinn and Ernest Holmes, who talked about the influence of positive thinking. Louise Hay increasingly studied more and more, dedicated much of her time to it, causing her to spend more time at church, to the point that she came to consider it her new home. Due to this novelty in her life, Louise began to lose interest in modeling. She pondered how much time she had left on a catwalk since, as much as she wanted to do, she wouldn't be able to make a living modeling forever, nor would she be able to have the perfect size of face that the job demanded. Louise decided to continue working as a model to support herself while she moved into this new stage of her life. She was excited to see what the future held for her. 3 years later, in 1971, thanks to her studies, Louise had the opportunity to take an exam to become one of the official healers of her church. Without much thought, She took the exam, which she passed with flying colors. The more knowledge she had, the more tools she had to heal her past wounds and her self-esteem, but she always put off healing these wounds, causing her to continue to harbor a great resentment. After a while, Louise became interested in studying on her own, so she enrolled in a 6-month course at Marahashi International University in Fairfield. Louise was very excited about the course, and she felt she was in the right place. There, she was able to learn things she was never exposed to, such as biology and chemistry, since she was never able to finish school. In this place, Louise Hay purified herself as she was always meditating, studying, and healing her body, and she was not allowed to consume alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs. After finishing the course, she returned to New York to continue with her daily life. There, she took more healing classes at her church and participated in social activities where she began to speak at meetings. These talks made people interested in her and her knowledge, so she began to have clients. From there, seeing such an opportunity, she dedicated herself exclusively to healing. Now that she had a job as a healer, Louise began to compile all the information she had learned from working with her clients to create her first book entitled Heal Your Body, to give to her patients. This little book came out in 1976 and contained a list of various types of physical illnesses and their metaphysical causes. Hay became successful as people began to heal through her teachings. This opened the door for her to travel across the United States to give lectures and classes on healing, self-love, and how positive thoughts influences our bodies and lives. For the first time in her life, Louise felt she was on the right path. However, even though Louise was helping many people heal, she was still stuck in a painful past she had experienced, and this, in the years to come, resulted in her body manifesting an illness of its own. In 1978, Louise Hay was diagnosed with vaginal cancer. This was certainly not surprising, as the abuse she had suffered at such a young age was more than enough to create a physical illness. Because of this overwhelming news, Louise was gripped with panic, especially when she was told that her cancer was incurable. While panicking, Louise felt that after so many years of training and healing, she had the tools necessary to heal herself through thought, just as she had done for several of her patients. That time in her life was crucial for her, for she had to put into practice all that she taught and preached. Louise knew that cancer was a representation of the painful emotions and resentment that she had accumulated over a long period of time. Because of this, she realized that she had not been able to dissolve all the hatred and resentment toward the people who had wrought irreversible damage to her in her childhood. To achieve this, Louise knew that she had to make a very big change in her mentality. To change her mentality was something laborious and complex, so she had a lot of work ahead of her, but she was sure that such an effort would be worth it, since she had the conviction that if she succeeded, she would not even need to have surgery to remove the cancer. These are Louise's words on this matter. If I had surgery to remove the cancerous formation and also freed myself from the mental model that caused it, the cancer would not come back. I further believe that if I could free myself from the mental model that had created the cancer, I wouldn't even need the operation. For 6 months, Louise set out to heal herself through the mind. She read and researched the different ways she could contribute to her healing. She bought dozens of books on cancer and purchased natural foods. She also used colon therapy, conventional therapy, and a natural diet to help her purify her body. On the other hand, she was interested in reflexology, which is the application of pressure to the feet or hands. Because she heard about the benefits this would have for her body, so she started looking for a specialist, but she couldn't find one. But one night, while at a conference, she met a reflexologist who happened to work at home. After that meeting, this specialist came 3 times a week for 2 months to Louise's house to do his work, which helped a lot in the healing process. Louise was amazed at how things lined up for her in her fight against cancer. Aside from all the above, Louise knew that in order to be completely cured, she had to love herself. Although she knew it was an important factor, For all those years, she kept putting it off because it was difficult for her, especially after having lived through so much suffering, abuse, and maltreatment. But she told herself that these experiences were not reason enough for her to put herself down and stay stuck. And she could not put it off any longer because she was in a life or death situation. Louise began to respect and love herself, telling herself every day in front of the mirror that she was wonderful and that she loved herself. Although it was difficult at first, she realized that part of her was changing. She started to feel she was no longer so judgmental and self-deprecating. On the other hand, in her therapy sessions, she let out all the pain and hatred contained within her as she cried, screamed, and punched pillows. While in her sessions, she was collecting fragments of memories where her parents came to tell moments of their life, and that, now being an adult, she could understand more easily. She was able to understand the problems her parents carried, feeling compassion for them. This compassion helped her let go of the resentment and purify her body. Thanks to all this internal and external work, at her next doctor's appointment, she was informed that she no longer had any traces of cancer. She was cured. Louise Hay was now firmly convinced from her own experience that illnesses of any kind could be cured if one is willing to change one's ways of thinking, acting, and believing. Because of this strong experience, she began to value life more. Louise Hay has said, "Sometimes, what seems like a tragedy ends up being the best thing that ever happened to us." After this event, she decided to leave New York, but not before talking to her patients and discussing the new forms of telephone consultations and annual visits. When everything was ready, she closed her practice and took a train back to California. In 1980, Louise Hay arrived at her hometown to settle down and start over. However, upon her return, she realized that things were not the same as before. Upon her arrival, Louise learned that her mother was blind. This hurt her greatly, as she could not believe that no one had told her anything in all those years. Despite the news, Louise maintained little communication with her mother, as it was not easy for her to stay close. Even though she had gone through all that internal process sometime before, she still harbored a bit of resentment at the sight of her mother. Because of this, she kept her distance. On the other hand, Louise Hay dedicated herself to attending all the meetings of the new era. There, she would introduce herself to some people, give testimony of her experiences, and then give them a copy of her book. Little by little, clients began to appear who needed her knowledge to heal, and others asked her to speak at meetings. These talks she gave made her more widely known. While Louise was increasing her portfolio of clients in California, she received a call from her sister after 2 years of not speaking to each other. Her sister informed her that their mother broke her back falling down the stairs. Her sister was unable to take care of her mother, so she asked Louise to do it for her. Of course, Hay agreed and took her mother home, where she cared for her. Now that they were living under the same roof again, Louise decided it was time to iron out the remaining differences between them, especially on her part, for life had given her the opportunity to care for her mother as she had been unable to do when Louise was a child. Over time, they came to understand each other and created a stronger bond, which allowed Louise to be at peace with the woman who had given birth to her. Additionally, Hay was able to convince her mother to have eye surgery to remove the cataracts that kept her blind, allowing her mother to see again. During her healing with her mother, she also had to heal her relationship with her younger sister, who confessed to her one day that her stepfather emptied all his anger on her when Louise took her mother away, making her a victim of constant violence. This situation moved Louise, who had no idea about the ordeals her sister went through, so she decided to help her heal mentally and physically. As for her career, in 1984, Louise decided to extend her little volume called Heal Your Body into a book which she titled You Can Heal Your Life. In this book, Louise Hay teaches us that often physical difficulties and ailments have their origin in a negative attitude towards life. Hay went on to write other books on healing that would later be published. Sometime later, Louise Hay founded a center for classes and courses. She also created the Hay House, publishing house where all kinds of books related to healing and self-help are published. At the end of the 1980s, Louise Hay created non-profit foundations called Hay Foundation and Louise Hay Charitable Trust, where she helped people suffering from any ailment, especially battered women and people with HIV. In fact, she created groups, the Hay Ride, which are a form of support for people with HIV. Louise Hay's work was so prolific that she won the world's recognition and even appeared on programs such as the Oprah Winfrey Show and the Phil Donahue Show. Louise Hay compiled a series of merits and influences that turned her first book entitled You Can Heal Your Life into a success. Because of this, by 2008, this book was on the bestseller list in the United States. Louise Hay was the author of more than 45 additional books that were published through her own publishing house, Hay House. This publishing house managed to generate an annual profit of around $3 million due to the sale of more than 10 million books and recordings. Her charitable foundation grew to the point of having more than 800 people helping the homeless each week. The hundreds of courses and lectures she gave at her educational center on healing, self-esteem, abundance, prosperity, and many other topics also contributed to her success and renown. As if that were not enough, Louise Hay's healing message was the subject of many newspaper and magazine articles. Additionally, she made several television appearances worldwide and had a monthly column called Dear Louise, which was published in more than 50 print media in the United States, Canada, Australia, Spain, and Argentina. In August 2017, Louise Hay, 90 years old, passed away in her sleep, leaving this world a great legacy of teachings. Louise Hay's story is a reminder that despite the conflicts of traumas we carry on our shoulders, we have the capacity to overcome and be a better version of ourselves if we set our minds to it. Also, her story shows that sometimes we must let ourselves be surprised by life and take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves to make the most of it. Because we do not know if that new path in our life, that path we never contemplated taking, is the ideal one for us. Louise Hay was a warrior who was able to overcome great difficulties most people would not endure, and if that were not enough, she was able to transform all that pain and resentment into a work that helps millions of people even after her death. Hay also showed us that we can and must allow ourselves to heal and love ourselves to achieve great things. No matter where we live on the planet or how difficult our situation seems to be, we have the ability to overcome and transcend our circumstances. Louise Hay. Don't miss our next video, and if you want to live abundantly, visit the link in this video's description.